Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this, convergent session experience talk on practice and discipline within a magical context. But we'll break that open. Really, that means everything to me. So let's begin by acknowledging country, which is what we call it in so-called Australia. So you might look out the window if you have a window in your room. You might just, come into your breath, noticing your breath. You might mute your microphone if it's not muted, and just paying attention to the place you're in, the reality that you're in, and finding that rhythm of breath that connects you to land and sky and sea, to country, to stars, to waves, to rocks, to caves, to mountains, to valleys, to deserts, to everything that is underneath cities and towns. Just a reminder to mute yourself if you're not talking right now, to mute your camera or mute your microphone. And I acknowledge that I am in Gadigal and Bidjigal country, this stolen country occupied by the British Crown, this invaded country, and yet it is sovereign. It is Gadigal and Bidjigal country, and I acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge their science and their kinship systems and their government systems and their grief and anger and rage and joy and beauty and art and lines of ancestry and descendants. I acknowledge the dreaming, the song lines, all that makes up the incredible sanctity and mystery of country. And I invite each of you to acknowledge where you are, whose land you're in. Maybe you yourself are First Nations or Indigenous as well. Maybe you're in your traditional lands, or maybe you're not for various reasons. I acknowledge any First Nations person here with us right now or listening to this later. I also pay my respects to the people, the elders, the activists who have inspired me and my work, some of whom I will mention today. Okay, so we will get into it. So today we'll probably only go for an hour and a half, as I have had a bunch come up today. So this will probably only go until my 12 midday, which is whatever that is for you. But practice and discipline is something that I think a lot of people, I think those words can activate people, can even trigger people, and for various legitimate reasons. In a witchcraft context, which is where I'm coming from, they are words that are often used to talk about refining, focusing, and deepening skills. It's also about orientation to the sacred in a day-to-day, nightly fashion. For me, I think of practice as anchors, tricks, or tools that deepen and refine my willingness to participate in the here and the now. And so sometimes I have to broaden and break open my understanding of the here and the now in order to do that, because of course, in Western materialist kind of reductive thinking, there's past, present, future in this linear A to B fashion. And so we would imagine that the past and the future is not the now. And yet, in kind of more animistic understandings, that ever unfolding becoming is totally all related to what is and what is emerging. And so, so much is a part of a witch's or a spirit worker's or a magic maker's practice and discipline. And I cannot represent anyone else except myself and my own experiences here. And so I'm going to attempt to be as open as I can but there will be limits to that with how I talk about this. And so you'll have to, translate in your own way, because everyone's version of practice and discipline is going to be obviously sacrosanct and individual to them. I think the idea of practice as a refining or as a focusing or as a deepening or as a presencing um, is really there to further underscore relationality and the interrelational reality of all things. So it's about turning up, I guess. It's about reaching out. It's about reaching in. It's about surrendering. Often we would say lucidly, consciously, chosen. But sometimes these things become sewn into the rhythm of our lives in such a way that, not that we forget them or that we necessarily do them without thinking, but sometimes and ideally they are just so present in our lives that it's not a big deal anymore. And every now and again, though, for me, I need to change something up so that I am brought back into a lucidity and a kind of a super consciousness about it. Because a lot of the point of ritual, for instance, especially like ceremony and ritual that humans do together, is to signal that something special is happening. So every now and again, I need to reinforce or reconsecrate certain things, like the lighting of a candle or the saying of a prayer or a mantra or a spell, or the way I sit or the way I make a gesture, so that that signals to me a special, specific gathering of consciousness. And when I say special, notice I'm not saying sacred, because for me, all of these things are sacred. Yeah, I can't really think of what is not sacred. So when I say special, I almost mean, I guess, what some people mean when they say sacred, like set aside, or kind of consecrated, or delineated to a certain endeavor or task, or way of being. So obviously, I'm coming from an animistic witchcraft experience. So that is coloring everything that I'm about to talk about. So I just need to be really clear about that, because witchcraft is also a magical practice, and in my mind, a quite experiential, immersive, visceral, sensual form of mysticism. uh, it therefore often brings up this question around that a lot of people have and ask me and ask each other and ask themselves, like, am I doing witchcraft? Am I doing magic? And so that question can become a source of paranoia, of pain, of fragmentation, of disappointment to people. And certainly in this day and age, there are all kinds of really horrific, there's a spectrum between kind of banal and horrific, but for different bodies and different neuro realities and different racial, socioeconomic realities, there are hindrances or limits that the state or that society reinforces, so that certain bodies have less capacity, or are seen to have less capacity, or are more like materially impacted by these imperialist colonialist systems, so that things like practice and discipline, or what we think of when we say that, meditation, lighting a candle, going for a walk, digging in the garden, like all of these things that we say are like good for you or whatever, it's really important to make sure that we are checking our own assumptions there, and coming into a more dynamic, pluralistic, multifarious understanding that tries to shed expectation around these things. Because there are various entryways, there are infinite entryways, infinite portals to how we relate to practice. The washing of dishes, if you're able to do that, or the stacking of a dishwasher, or even the way one gets up in the morning, and maybe that's completely confined to the bed or a certain room. The way we get up, or the way we begin to go to sleep, these can become infused with special observations or observances or things that we repeat in our consciousness or say aloud if we speak in words that can be heard. So there's all kinds of different realities going on, and they're all sacred and all special and all interesting, and as well as this, different lives, different bodies are impacted differently in these systems that we live in. So that needs to all be said before I kind of go into kind of my version of how I practice as a very able-bodied person, non-binary brown person, but who passes easily through the world most of the time. So that has to be acknowledged on my part. So in terms of the idea or the tension between practice and discipline, I think I like to use words that are provocative. So I always include discipline. One of the most intriguing things I ever read about discipline is that, and it came from T. Thorne Coyle, who is a fairy mystic, and maybe they would just say they're a mystic these days, but they've written many books, including Evolutionary Witchcraft. I think that was their first published book. And they were talking about this notion of, well, if discipline comes or is linked to this idea of being a disciple, and a disciple is someone who is dedicated to the teaching, then what is the teaching? So what is the teaching of a practice? Why do I value a certain practice? Why, for instance, do I value the triple soul alignment and grounding? Why do I value the practice of casting a circle? Why do I value the practice of Om and walking? Why do I value dishwashing in a certain way? I have a very particular way of dishwashing. Why do I value lighting candles and singing? So what is the teaching that these things carry to me? How do they deepen and focus and refine my presence in this world that is sacred? And how do I orient more with more capacity and more energy and more, I guess, more willingness is probably the better word to use, more willingness in the world around me, so that potentially I am met in a magical sense by that willingness as well, by that willingness from the spirits in the land and other beings and other biosystems that are all, intelligent and aware of each other and related to each other in deeply, deeply personal ways. So that sense of discipline, or what is the teaching, is, I think, a really important and significant way of thinking about this. What does this teach me? How am I opened by this? How am I deepening into the mystery through this? And one of the ways in which I have often navigated all of this is through this concentric ring model that I first meditated on, came into through my priestess training in the Wildwood tradition, which is this idea of 3 concentric rings that travel. I guess you could see them as traveling inward and outward simultaneously, but the center concentric ring is called self, and then the one that's wrapped around that is called community, and the one that is wrapped around that is called cosmos. Interestingly, several years after that was in my life, I was sitting with Munanjali and Yugambeh elder, an Aboriginal elder named Auntie Ruby Rose, and I was sitting with her on Yagara in Turrbal country, or so-called Brisbane, with a friend of mine, and we were sitting with her for a variety of reasons, and we had just come to listen, and we listened for 3 or 4 hours with her, and in the middle or somewhere in her talking with us, she described this 3 concentric ring model. And as she went through it, I just laughed and cried, because it was something that I already had as a specifically articulated thing in my life. But she called it, so the center ring, she called discipline. And I was like, as that word is like a love word of mine, so I was very excited. But she said, you could also call it self. And I went, oh, okay. And then she said, and the one that's wrapped around that is called community. And I was like, yep. And then, but she called the outermost one, the mother. And that's, I guess, her poetry, her phraseology, her cosmology for that. But that was totally equivalent with my understanding of cosmos. And I could equally just call that mother. And so, what I carry now is kind of like like a meeting of what she passed in that moment, and what I had already been working with other wildwood witches. And so this idea of all of these concentric rings influencing each other, folding into each other, and being completely irrevocably linked is a really important way of contextualizing practice and discipline for me. This idea that self, which can also be called discipline, is about how we arrive or relate to community, how community also nourishes, holds, and inspires or initiates self, and therefore lends the structures for discipline. So it can't just be, this idea of like, well, I am a self and therefore I have to turn up into community and be the best I can be. It's also, well, how does community in all of those interrelated connections nourish and hold and care for all these selves? And then, of course, all of that is in the ground of being that Auntie Ruby Rose calls mother, and that I sometimes have said is cosmos or the infinite. But that there's this larger law, there's this larger web that we all come from, and we're all made of, and we all return to. And so these kind of contexts, I think these contexts have been fragmented and broken in some parts of the world, in some societies. In fact, some societies thrive on the fragmentation and breaking of those sacred contexts. And so no wonder now there's all these people who are trying to have practice and discipline, and it's really fucking hard, and sometimes it's highly it's painful, or it's like, or it's hidden, or it's debilitating, or it's boring, or it's whatever, all of these things that are true. And so how do we come back into kind of consistently, constantly coming back into a harmony with self, community, cosmos, and with this concept of discipline carrying through? The way that I remember hearing Auntie Ruby talking about discipline was as a right relationship thing, was as an integrity thing. And so, integrity, I think, is an overused word, and maybe it's not understood all that easily. And we all have different kind of sensations of that in the landscape of body. But for me, integrity is this kind of powerful discernment that arises from a willingness to kind of drop all pretense to understanding. I have a friend who says that understanding is that trying to understand is interventionist, basically. And when I remember when she said that, I was like, oh wow, what an interesting, powerful way to think. Because humans in general, we all have different ways of understanding or trying to understand, but basically there's this idea that humans, we have to understand this, and this. We have to comprehend it. And that's, I guess, a human natural thing. And I wonder, does that limit, stop, trap our immersion in what is sometimes? And I think there's a difference between knowing and the seeking to always understand. In that way that, I was reading this book yesterday. It's called The Transgender Issue. Or I've only read like 12 or 13 pages, but it's quite amazing. And it's like this kind of, the way it's written is fierce and furious and amazing and articulated well. And in there, it was talking about this notion of the difference between trans memoir and kind of just writing about these issues that face transgender people of all kinds in the world, and why transgender liberation is really tied to all liberation from oppression. And this trans woman was saying that in the book, she was saying that, she didn't want to do trans memoir because she didn't want to kind of go into this idea that, oh, you have to understand me, you have to like know every, the ins and outs of me before you will like just, like respect my essential dignity as a human being. So this idea of understanding, I think, also kind of gets in the way of a willingness simply to be with another. We don't have to understand each other, actually, but this idea of just a willingness to turn up to each other and listen and receive from another without the need to evaluate or analyze that person. I think that's something that is lost in the so-called West, or deeply fragmented. And I see it in other parts of the world and other cultures I've had time with, like not this need to understand, but just a willingness to be with another. Of course, please don't think I'm demonizing understanding either. Like, I think understanding has its place as well. And of course, I'm working with words in a particular way, and that kind of. So let me come back to self, community, and cosmos. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, I'd like you to, or I invite you to draw these 3 concentric rings. So the central one is self, the kind of middle one is community, and the one wrapped around that is cosmos. Maybe you have other names, go ahead. But I invite you to just kind of draw them right now, these 3 concentric rings that are all holding each other. Maybe you've already done it, and to look at it, and to feel into it, and to notice how it makes you feel and what you're observing in that, because there's also all these other layers to it that we can map into it, so that there's kind of more of a felt sense of what we're experiencing. So I'm just going to invite us to do that and drop into breath, or rise through the breath. Hmm. And now I'm going to facilitate, I'm going to lead a practice that is just called grounding. It has many forms. Um, I think it's quite essential. It's like a very kind of fundamental thing to know how to do. For instance, I met with someone 2 days ago who was seeking one-to-one mentorship with me, and they're someone who I've known is very talented magically, but they're not trained magically. And so I asked them all these questions, and one of the first questions I asked was, do you know how to ground? I described it, and they said, I do know how to ground. And in fact, even though they'd never been trained, never read a book on it, never listened to anything about it, it followed the same pattern that almost all groundings follow. So there's something pretty intrinsically, at least human primate or mammal about this. So looking with your eyes open, but you might like alternate between closed and open, looking at the page in front of you, kind of rolling your shoulders back, or stretching and yawning and making sounds that make you happy. I like to click around my body and clap. So doing whatever helps you to be here now, or to just kind of wake up a little. Noticing the breath. And maybe deepening it a little, maybe getting wider and deeper with the breath. Maybe you have your hands on your belly so you can really feel the belly lift and fill. And also feel the small of your back also expand, and the sides of you expand when you breathe in, like a deep, deep diaphragmatic breath. Feel if it's okay for you, or just feel your way through it in the way you need to. But if you can, if it's comfortable, fill your lungs from the bottom to the tops. And remember, the tops of the lungs are just under the clavicle. They go really high up. So just breathing in. I like to touch the clavicle, these neck kind of bones, and breathe out. And when you breathe out, make some sound and let the exhalation be longer than your inhalation, helping the nervous system to re-regulate. I find also when I really exhale and really let all the air out of my lungs, I make a lot of space for that in breath. Already we're in a form of grounding. Some people will add things like this, they'll say, you know, gather yourself back from yesterday, from tomorrow. If you're thinking about rent, or if you're thinking about hanging out your laundry or cleaning the house because your friend's about to come over, because I'm thinking about that. Just acknowledge that thought and then imagine, feel, sense, and know that you are pulling it back in, that you're pulling yourself back to yourself gently or fiercely or firmly with the breath, with this rhythm of the breath. And maybe you see it like that tendrils that you're kind of curling back in, the way ferns sometimes curl back in. Calling self back to self. Here is where I like to sometimes incant or repeat, I am that I am all that I am. I am that I am all that I am. I am that I am all that I am. And then what I do is I feel down through my genitals, my perineum, my coccyx, and I feel thick as my thigh tree root, a taproot. And I feel the thickness. I know the thickness of my thigh, and I drop it down. I drop that tree root down, that taproot down. With exhalation, I drop it into the sovereign earth. And as far down as that root goes down, as that anchor drops, so does it also spiral outward. Feel yourself anchored and rooted, but also spiraling out in lateral directions, feeling yourself grounded in the earth of which we are a part. This is an act of remembering, quite literally, that we are intrinsically earth. Oh. And here is where we might call up power. We might drink in life force. With every breath in, we're making more and more room for that vitality to move through us. And not just be stored by us, but also to travel through this one into other life systems, other beings, if need be. Also traveling up through the length of this being, up through the crown of the head and the skull. And maybe you can sense and feel the sweeping of boughs and branches, of ferns and feathers, of threads and ideas, sweeping up and out. Maybe you feel or sense or know that you are becoming a tree, or maybe for you, you just feel this strength of being this human, or maybe you're a mountain or a stone or a song or a feeling or a memory. I invite you to imagine, feel, sense, and know that you are calling in this iridescent, incandescent river of starlight, drinking in this dreaming darkness that lives between the stars, that seeds the stars, and the stars pouring down. So this can also be a cleansing and invigoration as much as it is a grounding and a centering, grounded in earth, centered in stars. Feeling that river, imagining, sensing, knowing that that river of starfire is washing through us. If your eyes are closed, I really invite you to open them again and just do this while your eyes are open. And through that sense of vision, if you have it, being able to look around and ground through that, and ground also through your hearing, if you have that, or ground through your tactility, your hands, your feet, your skin. Maybe your smell and taste is a grounding portal for you. And in this way, feeling the below and the above meet, mix, mingle, marry, That phrase is a Wildwood phrase. It's one of my favorite phrases: meet, mix, mingle, marry, feeling that all come into the four-chambered, precious, powerful, fragile human heart. And maybe you touch your hand to your heart and feel it beating in your chest, mediating the powers of above, below, of left, of right, before, behind, of the infinite directions unfolding from you and collapsing into you. Maybe you tap your chest a little if that's okay for you, or maybe you make some sounds or say some affirmations or prayers. Maybe you notice that you've begun to automatically write or draw on the page. And perhaps this is one of the most crucial forms of practice because it helps us to stop and reflect and observe. It also is an effective way, a proficient way to, well, ground. That's why we call it grounding. So, like, coming back to this kind of equilibrium that we can then take stock from. And obviously, there's all kinds of ways to ground. In that grounding that I just kind of led us through, there's a lot going on. There's observation of breath. There's also a slowing down and a widening of breath. So this is de-stressing. We're able to kind of, our animal senses are able to relax most of the time. And then we're able to start to engage other ways of perceiving. Maybe that's visualization. Maybe that's the imaginal faculty that has multiple ways. Maybe that's the weight of our bodies on the floor, on the ground, on the bed, on the seat. Some people like to be standing and kind of moving while we're doing this. And then there's this tracing of a pattern, of a really prototypical pattern, which is this ancient tree or mountain or kind of central pole, which is really, really central and core to a lot of world cultures, to a lot of ancient cultures, this idea of the great tree or the great mountain or the great stone that links all the worlds. And so we're tracing this pattern, we're fusing, we're remembering that we're intrinsically earth, but that we're also intrinsically space and stars and sky. And so on that level, it's a way that we can both praise. It's not just this act of doing something that enables this or that or the other. It's also praising. I like to always remember how often the practices that I love the most are praising practices. They're venerative practices. And maybe that's because I'm extra bhakti or extra devotional, but it's just how I like to do things. That kind of sacred reverence, centering in that, I find that very grounding and very it increases my willingness to relate. And so maybe you're looking down at the page and you're thinking about self, or you're meditating on self or concentrating on this mystery of self. Sometimes we can get to sensations of self or perceptions through self by understanding what our deep or core values are. One of the ways that I most like to navigate or explore this is something that was inspired by a beloved Jarrah Staggard, who was a Wildwood priest. And a long time ago, he used to often, co-mentor with me. And so he would often challenge people to kind of keep going with under, like through the surface and down through many levels of what someone would say they value. So I've kind of articulated this exercise out of that inspiration. So the way I often talk about this is that, say you're meeting a friend, someone you really trust, someone you have a lot of history with, and you're at lunch or dinner or they're at your house or whatever, and they ask you, what do you value? What do you most value? And you might say honesty. You might just say that. And it might be true, but then this practice is about going deeper. And so what you might do then, and sometimes I'll do this with my phone and a voice note, or sometimes I'll write it out automatically. But the point is not to stop and intervene with it. So I might do this practice. I value honesty because I value truthfulness. I value truthfulness because I value depth. I value depth because I value space. I value space because I value time. I value time because I value water. I value water because I value weight. I value weight because I value openness. I value openness because I value space. I value space because I value patience. I value patience because I value precision. I value precision because I value compassion. And there's a place, there's a time and a place or a word or a theme or a concept, and I kind of hit it. It's almost like I hit the bottom of a well. And in that case, it was compassion. And so that's what I would say in that moment, because this changes, but in terms of word and articulation, but in that moment, it was compassion. So I invite you now to do that on paper or to do it out loud. And so I'll give you another example. It's like the kind of form of it is, I value this because I value this, I value this, and you just keep going. You don't think, you don't stop, and you don't try to understand it. So another example would be, what else would I say I value? I would say I value like presence. Okay. I value presence because I value willingness. I value willingness because I value spaciousness. I value spaciousness because I value warmth. I value warmth because I value connection. I value connection because I value time. I value time because I value feet. I value feet because I value land. I value land because I value sacredness. I value sacredness because I value truth. And so that one was truth. Some of those words made no sense to me in the moment, but I just have to go with it. So allowing yourself to do that now, I value this because I value this, and come up with several values, we would say deep or core values in this moment, and then we'll do a practice with that. So I'll kind of come back to you in about 4 minutes, but just kind of let that happen, write it down, say it aloud into your voice note recording thingy. So kind of to begin that practice, though, you have to kind of think of things. You have to go, I value this, I value this. So this is just an exercise. So treat it as an exercise. Okay. So we just kind of stopped recording there for a moment to do some kind of group debriefing or sharing. So one of the other things I kind of wanted to speak into was this idea of, I think I want to kind of break maybe a false idea, because I have a lot of people who've said to me, oh, I can't do this at the same time every day. I like, I try for a few days and then and it changes. And I'm like, great, whatever, like whatever you need. Like this idea that we need to ground or align our souls or run iron pentacle or go for a walk or, I don't know, light a candle at a specific time every day or every night as a form of discipline is false. Like, obviously, for some of us, we get off on that. Like, we get off on the same time and whatever turns you on, I think. So, like, if doing something at exactly the same time of day or night or evening or morning or dusk, and it's the same thing, like really exhilarates you, turns you on, to the life force, or just turns you on, and like gets you into it, gets you willing, that's great. But something that I think is just as valuable, in terms of developing finesse, precision, depth, spaciousness with what we're doing, especially as magic workers, spirit workers, witches, is also changing things up. So I will go through long phases, and sometimes that long phase is a year or two of doing the same thing in the same or in a similar way. But then I will feel, oh, it's time to change now. It's time to shed that. And one of the most helpful things for me in life has been to turn up at one of my altars, or maybe I'm doing it in the shower or walking to the sea. I live really close to the sea. So, and I just watch myself. I just observe myself, observing myself. And then I notice what arises. What do I naturally want to do? I once gave a challenge to an initiate, and I said, and I knew that they were getting into practice and discipline in a really big kind of regimented way, which I thought was great. But then I said to them, for a month, I don't want you to do any of that. I want you to consciously drop it all And then in that, I want you to notice, of course, this person could decide to do whatever they wanted, but this was my suggestion. I want you to notice the tension. Like maybe in the morning you get up and you go to align your souls, and then you realize, oh, but the whole point of this is that I don't do it. And then I want you to notice as you go to get water or go to the shower, what you want to do in a practice way, like in that way we think about practice, and then don't do it. and in that way, what is natural for you? What do you desire to do? Because I think it's important to figure out, what do I desire in my practice and discipline? What are the things that deeply enrich me and make me happy and joyful, or if not happy and joyful, if that's not what we're valuing in that moment, just like present or connected, or I don't know, dot dot dot, whatever you're valuing or needing in that moment. Whether that's venting or rage or whatever, these things are all sacred. So so this thing about like finessing a practice and kind of volleying with a practice and experimenting with one's own rhythms and landscapes around this, I think that's a really essential thing. Then there are those of us who really crave and need certain kinds of structures, because that is just the way we think and the way we focus, and is more helpful to us. So something that I crave structure all the time. And so one of the things that I do, therefore, as a spirit worker, as someone who's in dedicated relationship with these non-human spirits, is that I give days of the week to definitely turning up to those relationships. What do I mean by that? I mean that it could, like, I might be having experiences with the Queen of the Witches or my grandmother or the sea any day. Like, that's fine, like any day. But I definitely lean into or turn up to that relationship with Bridget and Hecate on Monday. And so, but obviously they might come to me in a dream, or I might have a conversation or read a book about them on a Friday, but I definitely do it on a Monday. And so I have this structure that is channeled through the planetary, the traditional planetary associations with those days. And different people will have different idiosyncrasies about the days, but I, as a traditionalist, I do like to go through classic kind of planetary alignments. And so that's just my persuasion. But so for some of us, we want to, okay, so like Monday is ruled by the moon, and this is the case in many cultures. And so like what do I link to the moon? So this is not about like the moon is, what do I link to the moon in my life? What would be helped by that force, that lunar force on a Monday? And so for me, it was Bridget and Hecate. It just kind of was, this is natural. This is what I'm going to do on Monday. On Tuesday, which is ruled by Mars, I noticed I needed, because the rest of the days are dedicated in relationship to other beings, I needed a day just kind of for myself as a being. So Tuesday is my rewarding, cleansing, focusing on kind of me and my like hygiene day, like my psychic hygiene and all of that. On a Wednesday ruled by Mercury, I turn up to my relationship with the master of the witches and with Hermes on that day. On Thursday, I turn up that day is ruled by Jupiter. I turn up to I turn up to the old god, and I turn up to certain angelic powers. On Friday, that's my day for Aphrodite, Freya, and the Lady of the Wildwood. On Saturday, I turn up to Persephone. Friday is ruled by Venus. On Saturday, which is ruled by Saturn, I turn up to Persephone and Ma, Kali Ma, and the dead. That's my day for the dead. And Sunday is my day for my fetchmate and my holy daemon, me as a divine being. And so this is something I've been doing in that particular form for about 2 years, and I haven't really desired to change it. There was a week a few months ago where I dropped it. And I just, because in my practice of dropping and shedding, I dropped it, and I noticed the next week it came right back because I loved it, because I was like, I love doing this. Like, this is meaningful to me. This is holding to me. Now, what kinds of things do I do? Well, if I'm really not feeling I have much capacity or energy on that day or that night, and I've realized I've gone through the day and night working and doing other things, and I'm like, oh, but I really like, my commitment is to turn up to that connection, I'll grab a book off my shelf on Bridget or Hecate, and I'll read a few paragraphs before I go to bed as an act of dedication. Or I'll put my computer next to me as I'm falling asleep, and I'll turn on a chant, and I'll fall asleep to that chant over and over and over again. So that it can be super simple. It's simply about turning up or remembering or kind of fine tuning into a certain connection. So if you're someone who, that's kind of my suggestion to people who are spirit workers, who have kind of multiple things going on with multiple spirits. I always, obviously, shrines. I love shrines. There are shrines all over my house, and I turn up to those shrines often. But you don't need them necessarily, and unless you in your negotiation with your spirit, it's discovered that actually they want that and you're willing to do it. But really, what's important is the turning up to the connection and the commitment part of that, or the discipline part of that, the right relationship part of that. That could honestly happen in one word. That could happen in an entire ceremony. It could happen in a process. I used to have this thing that I did every week for years. And I've actually been toying about returning to it because I actually really enjoyed it back then, but I haven't done it in over 10 years. But this thing I used to do with this very particular ritual, I used to do it once a week. And I would turn up to my main working altar, and I would do the whole ritual in which I would praise and bless and honor every single relationship. This included my human living relationships. I think part of the reason I don't feel the full need to go back to that is because every day the way in which I align my souls through my cauldrons, through the realms, and through the ancestors is a praising of all of that anyway. And many of you know exactly how I do that and have taken those classes with me, and that you know that that's a central part of how I kind of roll. But you kind of have to find what is actually speaking to your experience of the cosmos. What is helping to anchor, distill, and share that sacred experience. I always think it's interesting when I'm at a ritual, for instance, and these people are claiming to be animists or pagans or whatever. And I notice they're doing ritual actions that are literally destroying the soil or the grass, like throwing salt on it, for instance, or like they're doing things that are communicating the antithesis to what they're saying they feel and experience in the world. I don't think that is smart or helpful or I don't know, reflective. So for me, it's like, well, what are the ritual structures, the magical technological structures and forms that actually represent and reflect and emanate and express from my lived experience? I was not trained in certain systems of magic that do influence me. I've never been trained in traditional Wicca, although that there are forms and pieces and threads of that influence some of what I do, of course. But I'm not trained to throw salt on the ground, and I'm not trained to carry a sword around a circle. Those things mean nothing to me. I don't consecrate salt. Like, there is no salt on any of my altars. So there are certain things that I think a lot of people, when they're beginning to practice or get into the craft in a Western European sense, New World sense, and they're like, I have to have salt on my altar. Well, actually, you don't. So figure out, like, what are you drinking from? If you are attracted to traditional Wicca, then you'll go that way. You'll find a coven and teachers, and you'll have those experiences, ideally, hopefully, and then you'll be trained in certain things that matter to that tradition. And so this is when our own practices, our own ways of being as animals, as witches, as spirit workers, as mystics, if we want further apprenticeship training, focusing, we really have to go where we're already resonating, but also being challenged. So that's the other thing. The whole reason I think there's a sticking point or a tension with practice and discipline is because, yes, it does challenge us, and it ought to. The form and the flavor of that challenge, though, doesn't need to and should not cripple and debilitate us. So on any way, in any form, but the challenge is necessary. Maybe even the discomfort, but obviously, words and concepts mean different things to different people. So a kind of a useful map, another 3 concentric ring map that might be useful for you with that. This was passed on to me by Reclaiming and Fairy Witch Raven Stanfield. So she talks about this idea of the zone of comfort, the zone of discomfort, and the zone of overwhelm. And so, we're humans, we're primates, we're mammals. We love comfort. Nothing wrong with that. Comfort's great. Comfort, met with greedy capitalist corporate sponsorship, I don't know, maybe not so great, but comfort, like pleasure, being relaxed and chill and having a great time. Great, wonderful. Humans, we love it. Primates, we love it. And so that zone of comfort is nourishing, is togetherness, is helpful, is relaxing, is sleeping, is resting, is drinking, is eating, is whatever. And then when we're feeling willing, ready, able, sometimes when life does it to us, though, we move into a zone of discomfort. If we're able to ground and center and align within that and turn up to that, then we're going to learn a lot. We're going to harvest a lot of insight, probably. This is when I always say to people when like I have friends who go, I'm really thankful for that, that horrible thing that happened to me because I learned this. And I'm that bitch in my friendship circle who's like, really, are you really like thankful that horrible thing happened to you? Or are you thankful for your own ability to discern and harvest insight from it? Because I never want any of my friends to be grateful or thankful for like abuse or like I just don't like that mindset. So for me, I'm always provoking the idea that I'm grateful and thankful for you to have the kind of ferocious ability, presence, and willingness to harvest insight for yourself from a horrible thing. So obviously that's not always what discomfort is. Sometimes discomfort is literally getting up in the morning. And sometimes discomfort is eating or not eating. And sometimes discomfort is talking to a friend because talking to people can be fucking hard. Working through a conflict because that's so uncomfortable for most of us. I would say for all of us, I think. So then, we're growing, we're dynamic, we're with it. And then there's this other zone that, I'd connect possibly with the Tower card in the tarot, if you're familiar, which is overwhelm. And obviously life will take us into overwhelm. And sometimes we will take ourselves into overwhelm because capitalism, because internalized doctrines of Protestant productivity. One of the ways I've taken myself into overwhelm was definitely unchecked, unprocessed Protestant work ethic that comes down through my mother's line. And I didn't really, and even though I wasn't raised with Christianity, I didn't realize that that many generations of Protestants in my family had passed this thing to me through my mother, which was this: if I don't work and produce, I am not actually valuable or worthy of anything. And I have to still work on unraveling that complex and that demon and stalking that shadow and calling back my sovereignty and power and autonomy from that. I think I'm making some way with it, but it's a big one for me. And so part of practice and discipline also will therefore be identifying the complexes or the so-called demons or the so-called internalized kind of oppressive stories or fragmenting stories that keep us in these vicious loops or these debilitating loops that are stealing life force from us, leeching life force from us. Because one of the most important things to constantly kind of come back to in the practice of magic, in the practice of being alive, in the practice of relating, is like, where's my life force at? One of the most common forms of advice I give when I'm reading tarot to people, I've noticed, is when the Ace of Cups comes up, I say the same thing every time. Like, yes, it's self-love, creativity, openness to the divine, whatever, but I always say, give only from the overflow. So if you notice that your cup, your vessel of self, is like 3/4 full, 1/3 full of this life force, of this kind of presence of self, then fucking don't give. like, just be, because be with your friends, just be in your room, just be on the street, whatever. You don't need to produce. You don't need to express, literally express outside. You don't need to say anything. So, You don't need to post on Facebook. You don't need to be relevant on Instagram. I don't even know anymore. Like Twitter's failing. What's social media anyway? But you don't need to do any of that stuff. And so, what will rejuvenate? What will restore you? So that affirmation for me, I give only from the overflow, has so helped me in my life as someone who is a notoriously overgiving person, and probably everyone here is on some level. So this generosity of spirit we think is a sign of being spiritual. Like, nope. I am interdependent. I am woven into a web of relational responsibility, and my discipline is to remember that for myself. Obviously, humans also, I think a wonderful thing about my practice, at least, and probably yours, is it reminds me to step aside from those hooking games that we can sometimes participate in, where we're trying to hook another's attention, or we're trying to we're compromising our own values by manipulating a certain social situation to get attention, or whatever we're doing, because we human, and look around at these broken systems that we're a part of, or these systems that break us, rather. And how do we come into a place of responsibility with ourselves so that we are nourishing ourselves and therefore connecting to the life force that is nourishing us, kind of always, right? So I feel like my primary relationship and responsibility is to that life force. And I would, one of my friends, Lance would say that, really which is worship is the life force. And if I was pressed, I would say the same thing. If I was like, oh, what do I worship? Well, sometimes I like that word, sometimes I hate it. But if you made me say it, I'd say, yes, it's the life force I'm worshiping. And I is an expression of that life force. So much of practice and discipline is about centering back into that for me. I kind of skipped over structures a bit. There are other structures, elemental structures that come out of pentacles, if you're familiar with pentacle practices, structures that come out of the three cauldrons or the three souls, structures that come out of maybe some kind of medicine that you're practicing, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Western herbal medicine. There are structures and maps that we can distill and extract and create for ourselves to hang our practices on, because sometimes that's just very grounding, centering, orienting for us, like the days of the week and the planets. That's a map that I enjoy. And so, finding the maps that are going to be useful to you and going to be helpful to your way of thinking and feeling and tracking, that's, I think, definitely a third of the way into a rich practice. Knowing what you're hanging your hats on, knowing what your structures and maps are, that are helpful tools and talismans and tricks for you to navigate by. Some of this is also, some people really like timelines and timetables and schedules and post-it notes of different colors. Like, that really works for a lot of people. Some people what, again, back to what turns us on. Well, a thing that turns me on to the life force is singing and chanting. So much of my work, my capital W work, if you will, is singing and chanting. So much of the lore and the legend and the myth and the magic that my life is drenched in is encoded in song. So if I sing a particular song or I chant a particular chant, I'm stepping fully into those bodies of lore and rivers of legend and landscapes of myth easily now. So also singing is proven to change so much of our state of emotion in that moment. So singing can be one of those things we can do kind of anywhere, anytime, whether inside, like kind of inside the head, so to speak, or outside with the voice if we're able. And having that happen can really, really shift things. A lot of people also need to do, physical exercise. And I have a friend who right now that's his main gig. And he's a witch too. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is such a powerful practice for you. It combines breath and presence and precision and tracking energy. And I can see that for you, it's really, really nourishing and giving you kind of motivation for life. So that's the thing, right? Like it can be anything, and one's practice will not look like another's. And that brings, I think, discipline, therefore, is kind of the substance of the practice. If I think of discipline as that central kind of provocation of how do I turn up in right relationship, or what is right relationship in me, in all the aspects that comprise this one, or me, or us, or whatever, or whatever reality we're in. I think so. So this idea of discipline is what creates the practice. And we call it practice, of course, because, well, I call it practice because I'm fine-tuning, I'm refining, I'm focusing. I have an aspiration to mastery, but I don't think of mastery as I don't think of it as an end goal. I think of mastery in the witch's sense. And maybe this is the first time you've heard of this in the witch's sense. It's mastery is a term sometimes used in traditional witchcraft, and it links to this idea of the master of the witches. And when we say that, we're talking about this prototypical mercurial spirit who initiates witches. And that mastery, therefore, is this state that I might find myself in, or a process that I am distilled through. And it's not, I don't know if it's like enlightenment. I have no training in Buddhist philosophy, so I don't know if it's anything like it. But when they say chop would carry water before enlightenment, chop would carry water after. So that kind of hits a note for me. It's like, it's always practice. There's never a point in my life where it won't be practice. And so, but I do aspire towards mastery, and I do aspire to be in the mastery state. For me, what that means is that I can sense and feel completely that I am whole and complete unto myself, that I am sovereign, that I am interdependently woven into the weird, and that I can, because I too am God herself, that I can create, destroy, and transform. And that I am completely, creatively, poetically, lustily, mythically woven into that. Another thread I'll drop in before I kind of go, does anyone have any questions or thoughts, is this other concept I work with, which actually will, I kind of unpack it in my book that comes out in August next year, which is called The Which Belongs to the World. But there's this concept I work with that I've named the soul story. But there are various layers to that. So there's the soul story, and then there's the story spell, and then there's the spell song. And the soul story is something that both I am constantly co-creating, but that I am created by. It is a meta, all-encompassing mythos of me that I am within. So parts of my soul story are anchored in my relationships with gods, my relationship to Persephone, to Aphrodite, my relationship to certain groups of people, my relationship to landscapes. These are all anchors for the soul story, but they are not the whole of it. I don't think I understand my soul story, but I feel and sense it. And this kind of mythopoetic truth is another way of putting it, that I just kind of know, that I sense is the fuel to the fire of my expression. So then the soul story is the story spell. What's a story spell? A story spell can be encapsulated in a few words. Literally, the name I gave to this book that's coming out, The Which Belongs to the World. That's a story spell. Another story spell is, it could be, another story spell could be, I am queer and trans and beautiful and raw. Like that's a story spell. Like another story spell could be, the river of ancestors, that is me, is healing. And these are huge threads of magical richness that are directing and being directed by the soul story simultaneously. So the soul story acts through a story spell. The story spell is probably best expressed in a spell song. A lot of people think that means you have to like singing or sing. No, the spell song is anything that moves that through the worlds. A spell song could be, a spell song could be a song, but it's meta, it's deeper. It's I call it spell song kind of in reverence to the notion in many cultures that it is sound and song that creates all things and dissolves all things. And so that primal, cathartic, expressive, maybe orgasmic, maybe deeply silently meditative, like the idea that silence and song are actually divine twins. I really like that idea. And so the soul story, the story spell, the spell song, this is another way that I kind of surrender into what will be my practice. How will I relate? How will I ground and orient to the sacred today? You will notice that I acknowledged country at the beginning of this. That is a practice. Um, you know, my friends who are Aboriginal, they say always to me, make that, you know, make that practice as luscious and deep as you would do with grounding, alignment, and trance. So I try to spend a lot, like I try to like remind people and myself to go into my breath and to remember what we're doing and to be deeply present to what I'm saying, even if it's only a short thing in terms of middle world time. I want the same like flavor and feeling and presence to go into it. It's not something that I'm ticking off. It's not something that it's definitely something that I have to do. Like I absolutely have to do it, but it's not something I'm ticking off. It's an important reality in general, certainly in so-called Australia for other Aboriginal people, but for obviously for people who descend from invaders and settlers, or who are settlers as well, or refugees or immigrants, like for us all in various ways. And and if you're a lot of people ask me, well, I live in Berlin, I live in Amsterdam, and I'm like, cool, those countries are deeply linked to empire and colonialism. So so there's two steps there: acknowledge land, acknowledge the deep sacredness of the land you're in, acknowledge the spirits of place, acknowledge the old tribes of people who for thousands of years lived and there. Acknowledge the invasions too, acknowledge the Roman horribleness, acknowledge this and the fights and all of that you might remember and have been told stories of, but then also remember how and acknowledge the living reality of British colonialism, Dutch colonialism, Germanic colonialism. Like we have to remember that too. So that's an important practice to consider as well. And then there are all these other ways of thinking. Some people like to break it up like this. What are my mystical practices, my sorceress practices, my physical practices, my emotional practices? And then a good idea is to kind of loop them all in spheres and see in that kind of old school Venn diagram way, what are the practices that kind of overlap and belong to all of them, because those will be the ones that are probably the most helpful, most provocative to you, most initiating, most core. So you can kind of do that in your own time if you like. You can create your little bubbles, spheres, circles. You can see how you want to articulate those concepts. If mystical is something different to devotional to you, if physical is different to emotional to you, come up with your own articulations and then see what is the crossover, what is the overlap. That will be super useful. So, are there any like questions that you might like to ask or put in the chat? For me, those sacred realities form something deeper and wider. So it's definitely not a map. For me, it's not a map. For me, it's like a way of poetically describing this true thing, this kind of dynamic unfolding. I think one of the ways in which, look, certainly for me, one of the ways in which I connect to soul story in a visceral kind of sensatory way is I align my souls. And when I release the breath to the God soul at the culmination of that practice, I surrender into the soul story. Myself is distilled in it. And then the story spell is something I do a lot of, like in front of altars and like, or in the altar of life, walking down the road, whatever, I do a lot of kind of automatic speaking. Um, and so sometimes in that moment, it might be the charge of the goddess that comes out of me, or sometimes it will be a story or a legend or a folk tale or a fairy tale that comes out of me. And I let that, I literally often walking down the street, whispering a story to myself. Um, that's a practice that I have. And then that story linking me in the omen walk or the witch's walk to noticing all of these synchronicities and convergences that I'm a part of, is how I would put it. Um, and then, you know, so I can, interestingly, I can see myself having that practice, walking out the door, going down to the sea, which takes 15 minutes for me, and then getting to the sea and then singing wordlessly into the ocean. That's something that I would do, and something that I just realized I kind of naturally do, um, especially when I'm feeling restless and a bit kind of out of it, because then I come back into this really strong sensation of like existence and kind of exquisite wonder with it all. That's the way I would kind of phrase it now. But as well as this, you know, I would think of the songs that kind of made you, like literally songs. Like think of the songs that you, when you hear those songs, you're like, yes, that's a part of me. Like there are certain songs that hit me in painful, joyful, grief ways, like the stuff of life ways. And then I make playlists out of them and I listen to them and I lay there and I roll around in my bed or I dance, you know, those kinds of practices. Or I dare myself to go to an open mic night and sing one of them. I've done that before. Or I say to a friend, hey, can we sing this song? You know, so that's the thing. After a while, that's kind of just the way of things, isn't it? Like we, what just makes you happy or joyful or in that moment is required emotionally in a way that isn't intrusive but is expressively beautiful or expressively resonant. The other thing, of course, for me as a writer is the writing of it. Um, so if you're a writer or a songwriter, like write it down. One of my favorite things in life is reading people's stories, truly, like memoirs, autobiographies, blogs that people, where people richly talk about their experience. I'm mostly interested in that. My favorite magical witch books are the ones that where the people are talking about their experiences. I love those. My favorite books in general. There are certain shows and programs that are similar for me. Yeah, honestly, it's infinite. It's infinite. And I'm sure that once that you process those concepts, you might realize how you already know them, and then you might realize, oh, I've already crafted that, and then and then you just might have more energy or more intriguing perspectives on it or something. There is a question in the chat. I haven't found a practice that really feeds me, and I don't know how to find one. So rather than a practice that feels like it's draining life force or taking energy from other parts, and I acknowledge it might just be the stories I tell myself about it that I know are bullshit. Yeah. So um definitely I would say some of that is stories and complexes. The other thing that I may have only alluded to is sometimes magical practice doesn't feel good. Here's another thing that I have recently started telling people. Sometimes you just go through the steps. Like I truly, there are so many times that I'm doing something feeling absolutely nothing, and yet there's a deeper, wiser part of me that's saying, go through the steps, you won't regret it. um and so I definitely do things by rote sometimes. I definitely go, I know that this is really good for me, like, and by which I mean not in moralistic puritanical ways, like it just is helpful and nourishing. It has been in my life, it will be again, and I'm going to do this. In the moment it might be like I might be like judging it, cynical, whatever, but I just do it sometimes. I just do it. um and honestly, my answer is not going to probably be tailored for the person who asked that question or anyone who asked that question. Like sometimes like I think it's all about broadening and widening what we think of as practice, actually. Because cooking is practice. You know, it's a practice that I can sometimes bring myself to, and sometimes that I'm like, ugh, gross. But now I live in the discipline of cooking every second night, because my housemate and I have created this beautiful interdependence where we cook for each other. And so because of that, I have this discipline now to come into right relationship with the cooking. So I bring myself to cooking when I don't even like cooking. So that's this like going through the steps. But I will tell you that when I'm eating with my housemate, I'm feeling so joyful that we are sharing this meal, that it's delicious, because I personally love food. I know some people don't like food. And yeah, I'm like living my best life. So so it's all like, all this stuff is complex. And the other thing that I remembered in the shower I wanted to say is that some people really need a group. Like, that's that whole self community thing. Some people need a group. So if you're like, I'm like flailing around in my practice, like I'm doing this on purpose, like doing inverted commas, then make a group, craft a group, have 3 friends, 5 friends, 7 friends who you know will work well together, or experiment. Maybe you won't, and then you'll have to move on or transform the group. But like grab onto something. Like it could be that you take a book and work through it. It could be that you're all like, we all want to get really strong with our spirit work. So we're going to like work on aspecting and transpossession together. We're all going to learn different trance techniques and mediumship techniques together. And obviously there'll be different people in that group with different skills and different experiences to add to that. Yeah, look, the overwhelm, I can't speak for your overwhelm or anyone's but my own. There's a story that will, like, it might not even be relevant to you, but there's this thing that happened to me once where so my experience of anxiety is that it flares with interpersonal conflict. That's when I feel like I'm drowning. Like if I feel like I've really fucked up and the other person is angry at me, oof, I'm drowning. I've lost the plot. And so this happened to me several years ago. I was with my friend Jane Meredith, and we were about to do like a 3-day lock-in Pearl Pentacle intensive by ourselves. uh, and um, and then I was coming up from Byron Bay towards the house we were going to stay in, and I'd been staying with a friend of mine from Bali, who's a British person, but who was living in Bali at the time I was, and we had this huge conflict that actually had nothing to do with us, but had to do with how I related to someone that they were in conflict with. Of course, right? Um, and and so then I had this huge collapse and anxiety that they would never speak to me again, that the way in which I had kind of mediated that situation was incorrect for them. And I was like racing, anxious. I was crying and shaking and all of that stuff. And then I was with like Jane Meredith, and I was laying in a bedroom crying and shaking and losing the plot. And she just gently came up to me in her way and went, you know how you're always talking about aligning your souls and making Kala and running iron? And she just said it in this really like firm, not sarcastic, just way. She's like, now is the time to do all of that. And I realized how true that was, that I practice in times of evenness or equilibrium, so that when shit hits the fan, those grooves are so strong that if I can just begin to do the breath, if I can just even say a phrase, that it goes in. Like the groove is so strong, the river takes me. And so I literally got up out of the bed, even though it felt like horror, and I went out to the veranda, and I lined my soles, I made Kala with the water, I ran iron, and then I ran pearl. It took me about 20 minutes, and I just gave myself to it. I gave myself to it through the overwhelm. But the thing was that it changed my entire state of consciousness. I was grounded, I was centered, like really, not like as an idea. And then I could see the way out of my anxiety, and I walked my way out. And I have to acknowledge that I don't have a lived experience of living with a named anxiety disorder. Thank you so much. I will send this recording to you all and to those who couldn't make it. And so, yeah, so this has been one of 3 kind of gifts back to you all. Many of you have taken classes from me multiple times. So the other ones will be a bit like, so this has kind of been a bit more like talky, blah, blah, blah. But then I have one on Mary Magdalene, which I imagine will provoke some people, but it's going to be much more trance-based and sensual and like singing, lots of singing, devotional. And then I have this more like for the history nerds. I have this more like, and now we investigate the witch trials in England and Scotland. And that's very specific because the witch trials in England and Scotland are definitively contrasting to the ones in France, Germany, and Spain. And I know more about them. So I'm super excited to share that kind of knowledge. So I'll let you know when that's all happening. So much love to all, and have lovely days and nights. Mwah. Thanks, everyone.